Yeah, let's try and unpack this. The last few days, June 13th to the 15th, 2025, it felt less like things just happening and more like, I don't know, the world hitting fast forward on a whole bunch of crises all at once.
Yeah, it really did.
We saw, major conflict ramping up in the Middle East, serious tensions flaring up domestically here in the U.S., and then this whole cascade of other big events just unfolding everywhere. It was, well, there's a lot to keep up with.
Absolutely. A period of incredibly intense, interconnected global activity. For anyone just trying to stay informed, it must have felt like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Exactly. That's the perfect way to put it. And that's really why we're here. Our mission with this deep dive is to take that fire hose of information, all those headlines, the reports, the analysis from this specific time frame that you've shared with us, and kind of filter it down.
Mm-hmm.
We're pulling out the absolute most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights, specifically for you. Think of this as your way to cut through all that noise and get genuinely well informed on what happened over these critical few days.
Right. We want to help you understand not just the sequence of what happened, but the significance behind it all. The potential implications, and maybe how these seemingly separate pieces actually connect on a bigger stage.
So we're going to jump right in. First, that dramatic escalation in the Middle East. Then we'll explore the complex picture of U.S. domestic unrest and politics during the same time. And finally, we'll touch on some other significant global developments and their immediate impacts.
Okay, so the Middle East. The sources we looked at are framing this as, well, the most serious confrontation between Israel and Iran in decades, really bringing the region right to the brink of a much wider war.
And it gets really intense right from the start. It kicked off with Israel's actions on June 13th. They launched something called Operation Rising Lion. And this wasn't just, a small strike. We're talking a large-scale bombing campaign, over 100 sites targeted deep inside Iran.
Yeah, over 100 sites. And the targets weren't just random military bases either. Based on the reports, the strikes specifically hit really key parts of Iran's infrastructure.
Like what specifically?
Well, sensitive nuclear facilities, for starters. Places like Natanz and Fordo were mentioned. Also, major weapons depots and command centers belonging to the IRGC, that's Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
And tragically, the sources also reported the deaths of specific, very high-profile figures in those strikes. We're talking about the IRGC Commander-in-Chief Hossein Salami
Mm-hmm.
and a senior nuclear scientist, Faridun Abbasi. Israel's stated goals for this operation, according to Prime Minister Netanyahu anyway, were one, to cripple Iran's nuclear program, which he claimed was alarmingly close to being weaponized,
Right, that was the claim.
and two, self-defense against what he called an imminent nuclear threat. Target assassinations were clearly part of it too.
And the immediate aftermath in Israel. They declared a state of emergency, closed their airspace. They were clearly bracing for a response.
Which came pretty quickly, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. Iran launched well over 100 drones and ballistic missiles towards Israel. The sources mention specific types, like Shahed variants, which are known for their range and capability.
Now, Israel has those defense systems, Iron Dome, David Sling, designed to stop exactly this kind of thing.
They do, and they intercepted a lot of them, according to reports.
Yeah.
But some projectiles definitely got through. The reports confirm civilian casualties in Israel, at least 3 killed, over 130 injured.
Wow.
And damage reported in major cities like Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Beersheba. So the defenses weren't impenetrable.
And Iran's perspective, how do they frame it?
They framed their actions as, quote, just retaliation for acts of Zionist aggression, and they vowed to continue their resistance. So by June 15th, just 2 days later, this was already the 4th straight day of open warfare. Missile exchanges ongoing, casualties rising on both sides.
It's chilling. And the wider implications. What were the sources saying with the risk of this spreading?
That was a huge concern looking at the analysis, a significant risk of secondary conflicts. Military analysts were immediately pointing to the potential involvement of groups like Hezbollah up in Lebanon, or maybe impacts on U.S. bases in Iraq, potentially even drawing in other Gulf states. This wasn't just an Israel-Iran fight in isolation. It really had the potential to ignite the whole region.
And you saw that potential immediately hit the markets, right? Oil prices.
Absolutely. Brent crude surged significantly right after the strikes. Initially jumped somewhere between, 7 and 11%?
That's huge.
Yeah, clearly fueled by fears of disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz. That's such a critical choke point for global oil transit. Any threat there sends shockwaves.
And diplomatically, things must have ground to a halt.
Pretty much. planned U.S.-Iran nuclear talks, the ones scheduled in Oman, postponed indefinitely. You had urgent international calls for restraint coming from everywhere. And it's worth noting, too, the UN General Assembly actually adopted a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza during this same period.
Interesting timing, highlighting the connections.
Exactly. It shows how these different regional conflicts are becoming linked in the global conversation.
What about the U.S. position in all this? The sources suggested it was a bit tricky.
It seemed complex, yes. Reports indicated they were advising caution. There was even one report suggesting they rejected an Israeli plan to target Iran's supreme leader himself.
Really?
Yeah, signaling they were wary of escalating things even further. But at the same time, the administration faced criticism from some quarters for, well, not preventing the initial Israeli strikes in the first place.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't, sort of.
Kind of felt that way. And we also saw other reactions bubbling up internally within Iran, or at least related to it. The exiled Iranian crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, he made a public appeal, urged the Iranian military to abandon the current regime, and he directly blamed Supreme Leader Khamenei for the whole conflict.
Wow. So pressure from outside, and maybe hints of it inside, too.
Exactly. Gives you a sense of the different dynamics at play.
Okay, so while all that was unfolding, back here in the United States, this same period saw a very different kind of tension building. Significant domestic unrest, political friction.
Yes, definitely. A major event was the No King's Day protests. That was June 14th. Reports said millions participated nationwide. Something like 2,000 rallies held across the country.
Yeah, huge numbers, with big gatherings in cities like Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Atlanta.
And the core message, the target of these protests, as highlighted in the sources we saw, was pretty broad opposition to the Trump administration's policies.
Right. But the situation in L.A. seemed particularly volatile.
It did. Unrest there, largely centered around immigration enforcement actions, actually prompted President Trump to deploy both the National Guard and U.S. Marines to the city.
Marines on U.S. soil for domestic unrest. That's significant.
It is. And while the sources generally described the protests nationwide as largely peaceful, there were certainly reports of incidents, some violence, confrontations with law enforcement, especially in that L.A. area where tensions were highest.
And this overlapped with a legal fight over the National Guard, didn't it?
Yes, a really significant one, about who actually controlled those troops in California. A federal appeals court stepped in, temporarily reversed a lower court's order.
Meaning what?
Meaning it allowed President Trump to keep control over about 4,000 National Guard troops in L.A., effectively overriding the authority of Governor Gavin Newsom.
Ah, the federal versus state control issue.
Exactly. It cuts right to the heart of that during domestic crises. And it wasn't over. Another hearing was scheduled, so that legal battle was ongoing.
And then adding another really worrying layer to this domestic picture. There were reports of politically motivated violence.
Yeah, deeply concerning reports. A manhunt launched in Michigan. A gunman apparently targeted 2 prominent local Democrats, killing one of them and her husband.
And officials specifically called it politically motivated.
They did, according to the sources, which, understandably, significantly heightened all the existing concerns about political violence in what was already a very tense national climate.
So you've got protests, military deployments, legal battles over authority, and now targeted political violence.
And right in the middle of all that, on the very same day as the No Kings protests, June 14th, there was another major event. The U.S. Army held a grand parade in Washington, D.C.
Oh, right, the Army's 250th birthday.
Correct. But it also happened to be President Trump's 79th birthday, and he presided over the parade.
Any idea on the cost of that?
The estimates cited in the reports ranged between $25 and $45 million.
And the reaction?
Quite divided. While it was presented as this historical tribute, many critics saw it as, well, politicized, maybe reminiscent of authoritarian-style displays of military power.
Right.
And the sources explicitly noted that the No Kings protests happening simultaneously partly emerged as a condemnation of what they saw as using the military for political spectacle.
So in the U.S., during these few days,
Oh, yeah.
wow, you had widespread protests, this federal power struggle, actual political violence, and a controversial military parade all at once.
It paints a really complex picture of the domestic tension at that moment.
Okay, let's zoom back out globally for a second and connect back specifically to the economic impact we touched on earlier. Because as that Middle East conflict escalated, the effect on global markets was pretty immediate and stark, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. On June 13th and 14th, you saw global stock indices take a significant hit. The S&P 500, that broad measure of the US market, down about 1.1% to roughly 5,977.
That's a noticeable dip in just a day or two.
It is. The Dow Jones dropped by 1.8%, the Nasdaq by 1.3%. These aren't just minor fluctuations. This shows real market anxiety, clearly driven by the geopolitical news.
And I assume we saw the classic flight to safety.
Yep. The predictable rush towards those perceived safe haven assets, things like gold, the Swiss franc, U.S. treasuries. Investors were looking for stability, moving away from riskier stocks.
And beyond that initial spike in oil prices you mentioned.
Well, there was significant ongoing volatility because of the sheer potential for supply disruption. That immediately started worrying energy-sensitive industries. Think airlines, shipping.
Right, fuel costs.
Exactly. They face rising costs if fuel prices stay high or just become unpredictable.
And some analysts were even starting to talk about stagflation.
Yeah, that term started popping up in some analysis mentioned in the sources. The concept of a potential stagflationary shock, which, for you listening, means that worst of both worlds scenario. Economic growth slows down while prices are rising.
A really tough situation for economies.
Very tricky. And big geopolitical events like this Middle East escalation, especially when they impact energy prices, are classic potential drivers of that kind of risk.
So central banks must have been watching this very closely.
You bet. This market volatility, the potential inflationary pressure, it prompted central banks around the world, the Fed here in the US, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, to start resetting their plans, for interest rates, monetary policy.
Right.
And broader concerns were definitely being raised about the stability of global supply chains, which are still kind of fragile from recent disruptions, and just the overall path of the global economic recovery.
Okay, so shifting gears slightly,
Mm-hmm.
but still during the same intense period, there were other major global diplomatic and trade things happening too.
Yeah.
The G7 summit kicked off in Canada.
It did, open in Kananaskis, Alberta. And while the leaders, they had a packed agenda already, trade talks, navigating the relationship with the U.S. administration, strategies for getting off Russian fossil fuels, tackling inflation.
The Middle East crisis just took over.
It immediately became the main discussion point, yeah, overshadowing a lot of the other planned topics.
And President Trump was there. What was his approach, according to the reports?
Well, he met with leaders like Canada's Carney, UK's Starmer. Reports from the summit suggested he resisted joining a sort of unified G7 condemnation of Israel's actions. But he did signal openness to potential trade deals, tariff discussions, keeping the focus partly on his own trade agenda, it seems.
So maybe testing G7 unity on the Middle East issue.
It certainly seemed to, even as Europe was continuing to push its own measures, like aiming to end reliance on Russian fossil fuels by 2027. So yeah, global markets weren't just watching the bombs fly, they were watching the G7 for any signs of a diplomatic way out.
And elsewhere on the global stage, Taiwan made a significant move during this period too, right? Adding some big Chinese tech companies to its export control list.
Yes, Huawei and Susmic. And this move, as reported in the sources, wasn't just some minor trade tweak. It significantly ramps up those existing trade and technology frictions.
Between who?
Well, obviously with China, but it impacts the U.S. and others too. It really reflects that broader global competition over who controls key technologies and critical supply chains. It's another clear example of that sort of tech Cold War playing out.
Interesting. And then there was that slightly more unusual diplomatic event. French President Macron visiting Greenland.
Yeah, maybe less dramatic, but still noteworthy. He used the visit to really emphasize European support for Greenland, for the Arctic territory, and he very clearly rejected any notion of it being sold or transferred.
Which sounds like a reference to...
A not so subtle reference to previous U.S. interest under Trump in potentially buying Greenland. So a bit of diplomatic signaling there, too.
Got it. So beyond these major geopolitical hotspots, the sources also highlighted significant conflicts and violence happening elsewhere during this time, didn't they?
They did. A reminder that the world faces many diverse challenges simultaneously. In Nigeria, for example, there were reports of deadly herder-farmer clashes in Benue State, at least 100 deaths mentioned.
Wow.
Yeah, highlighting those persistent security challenges driven by things like resource competition, ethnic tensions in that region. It's an ongoing tragedy.
And in Kenya? Protests there, too.
Yes, protests erupted after a police officer was arrested in connection with the death of a blogger, Albert Ojwang. This incident points to those ongoing tensions over police accountability, freedom of expression, issues that resonate globally, really.
Sadly, this period was also marked by some major disasters and accidents, adding to that global sense of unease.
It really was. One of India's worst recent aviation tragedies, the Air India Flight 171 crash. Technically, it happened June 12th, just before our main focus period, but the aftermath was heavily reported during these days.
That was the Boeing 787 from Ahmedabad.
Correct. And the death toll tragically rose to 279. That included 38 people on the ground where it crashed. Authorities were starting the incredibly difficult process of DNA identification, handing over remains, a huge national tragedy for India.
And severe flooding, too, in multiple places.
Yes, hitting hard. In South Africa's Eastern Cape, the death toll from floods reached 86. And in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, floods and landslides in Kinshasa killed at least 19.
Devastating.
Both disasters displaced thousands of people, severely straining emergency services that were already stretched thin.
Were there other accidents mentioned?
Yeah, sadly, there were reports of other tragic accidents dotted around the world during these few days. Fatal bus accidents mentioned in both India and France. And a hot air balloon crash in Turkey that killed the pilot and injured 19 Indonesian tourists.
Just serves as a reminder, doesn't it? Vulnerability to hazards, both natural and human-made.
Absolutely.
And lastly, tucked away in the sources, there are a couple of other notable items. Something about U.S. Steel.
Right. The Trump administration outlined a plan for U.S. Steel's operations under this new investment structure involving Nippon Steel of Japan. It was a deal that apparently raised significant concerns among labor unions about, jobs and national security implications.
Okay. And the Vatican.
The Vatican announced the beatification that's a step towards sainthood of a Congolese customs worker who was killed for resisting corruption, offering a sort of positive counter-narrative, a role model in regions often affected by violence and graft.
So, stepping back and looking at this whole period, June 13th through the 15th, 2025, what really becomes clear from reviewing all these sources is, wow, this wasn't just a busy news cycle.
No, not at all.
It was a period defined by simultaneous, really intense crises just erupting across the globe. You had the Middle East conflict escalating dramatically,
Right.
the real potential for a wider war just looming. You had significant domestic unrest here in the U.S., legal fights over power, that deeply unsettling political violence. And alongside all of that, the market volatility, major diplomatic summits scrambling to react, the tech friction ramping up, and these tragic disasters.
It's a heavy combination.
It really is. And our goal in this deep dive, just to reiterate, was to take that mountain of information you provided from this period and really navigate through it, pull out the key threads, define the terms, highlight the important nuggets of information and what they might mean specifically for you.
And what really stands out, I think, is how interconnected everything feels now. You see geopolitical conflict immediately hitting global markets, domestic tensions maybe reflecting broader global anxieties or trends, diplomatic meetings forced to react instantly to events unfolding thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
It's just a stark reminder that in our hyper-connected world, very few crises truly remain isolated anymore.
So, thinking about that, given the sheer speed and intensity of everything that happened in just those few days, and the amount of information we're all constantly trying to process, what does this snapshot maybe suggest about the overall state of global stability right now?
That's a big question.
It is. And considering the really diverse range of hotspots and challenges we've touched on, from war to protest to tech battles to disasters, what are the biggest challenges ahead? For us as individuals, for societies, trying to navigate such a complex, multi-crisis world, it certainly gives you a lot to think about, doesn't it?
It really does. We hope this deep dive has helped provide you with a clearer picture of these critical few days, though, giving you the insights you need to continue exploring, maybe connecting the dots yourself, based on the knowledge we've managed to share from these sources today.